Hey everyone. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about headaches and migraines. Okay, so we all get headaches, we all get migraines, and we know that they're no fun, they're painful, and you want to get rid of them very quickly when you do get them. So usually when you get a headache, there's a variety of reasons why you might get a headache. It could be due to tension, stress, eating a processed meat diet, which has a lot of nitrates in it, which triggers headaches. It could be from poor posture. It could be from sleeping wrong. It could be from underlying disease. There's many reasons why you would get a headache. So usually when you have a headache, you'll go get an over-the-counter pain pill. You'll go get ibuprofen. You'll go get Aleve. You'll go get aspirin, Motrin, a BC powder, a Goody powder. You'll go get one of those things. You'll take it. Usually within 20 and 30 minutes, you're fine. Headache's gone. You back in business. Okay, so why would you be interested in trying to find a natural remedy for a headache or a migraine? Well, let's look at this study that was done on ibuprofen. So, according to the National Institutes of Health, people who take NSAIDs may have a higher risk for heart attack or stroke risk. And then this article says that ibuprofen has a negative impact on the testicles of young men, according to a study that was published Monday in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They found that when taking ibuprofen in doses commonly used by athletes, a small sample of young men developed a hormonal condition that typically begins, if at all, during middle age, and this condition is linked to reduced fertility. And then let's look at another body of information that was published by Harvard Health. So risk of aspirin. Since aspirin reduces the blood's ability to form clots, it also increases the risk of bleeding. The most common form of serious bleeding is gastrointestinal bleeding. Very rarely, bleeding into the brain can occur, which may result in disability or death. That is why you should discuss whether to be on aspirin therapy with your doctor and not just start taking it. Okay, so you may say to yourself, I'm starting to see that these over-the-counter pain pills may not be as good for me as I may have thought that they were. So what are some natural remedies that I can use for headache or migraine? So some of you may know, some of you may not know that aspirin is actually derived from a plant. And so this article says from a tree, a miracle called aspirin, right? So it says if you take aspirin, you've got a pain reliever, heart attack preventer, and possible cancer preventer rolled into one tablet. You might think that whoever invented aspirin is a genius, but the truth is humans have been using its natural equivalent for thousands of years. Aspirin is one of those things that long before there were ever clinical trials or any kind of scientific knowledge, people figured out. Hey, I feel better when I take this substance. This drug has been making headlines because a study in the Lancet recently found that a daily aspirin appeared to lower the risk of cancer. Blase, blase. So let's get into the history of aspirin. The word aspirin wasn't a coincidence. It comes from spirea, a biological genus of shrubs that includes natural sources of the drug's key ingredient, salicylic acid. So remember that word salicylic acid because that's very important. This acid, resembling what's in modern-day aspirin, can be found in jasmine, beans, peas, clover, and certain grasses and trees. Right. The ancient Egyptians used willow bark as a remedy for aches and pains. So willow bark is what modern-day aspirin is derived from. They didn't know that what was reducing body temperature and inflammation was the salicylic acid. Hippocrates, the Greek physician who lived from about 460 to 377 BC, wrote that willow leaves and bark relieve pain and fevers. It wasn't until thousands of years later that people began to isolate the key ingredient of aspirin. An 18th century clergyman, Edward Stone, rediscovered aspirin, in effect, when he wrote a report about how preparation of powdered willow bark seemed to benefit 50 patients with ague and other maladies, Roach wrote. In the 1800s, researchers across Europe explored salicylic acid. French pharmacist Henri Leroux isolated it in 1829. Roche writes, Herman Kolbe discovered synthetic salicylic acid in 1874, but when administered often in large doses, patients experienced nausea and vomiting, and some even went into a coma. So I highlighted this because I want to come back and touch on this because these people isolated salicylic acid from the willow bark, which is not good, but I'll come back to that later. And so they realized that a buffer was needed to ease the effects of this acid on the stomach. The aspirin, we know, came into being in the late 1890s in the form of acetylsalicylic acid when chemist Felix Hoffmann at Bayer in Germany used it to alleviate his father's rheumatism, a timeline from Bayer says. Beginning in 1899, Bayer distributed a powder with this ingredient to physicians to give to patients. The drug became a hit, and in 1915, it was sold as over-the-counter tablets. Okay, so going back to what I highlighted. So they basically isolated salicylic acid, acetylsalicylic acid from salicylic acid, which was found in the willow tree. So the problem with isolating chemical compounds is there's numerous problems. First of all, plant chemical behavior is very complex. So when you have a tree or any plant, it usually has hundreds, if not thousands, of chemical compounds, which all work together synergistically. So many isolated plant compounds don't function in the same way as they do when given in a whole plant extract, which is why when they tried to isolate and make synthetic salicylic acid, patients experienced nausea and vomiting, and some even went into a coma. And so that's when they realized that they needed to add a buffer to it. But when people were just taking the willow bark, the whole plant willow bark, they were fine. They were using it for thousands of years, right? So what they realized was that because what they try to do with a lot of these modern pharmaceuticals is they'll try to isolate a so-called active ingredient, but there's no such thing as an active ingredient because, like I said, plants have hundreds and hundreds of different chemical compounds that they all work together. And even though they may appear to be non-active, when they enter into your body, they are actually active. And some quote-unquote non-active compounds actually increase absorption, distribution, metabolism, or excretion of some of the other compounds in the plant. So when you isolate a plant, when you isolate a chemical from a plant, you're actually doing a disservice to the individual because those other compounds are needed in order to make the plant safe, which is why a lot of times when you have these over-the-counter drugs, they're toxic on the liver because they don't have all the other parts that are needed to detoxify it itself. So here's an article that was published that I found on PubMed, and it says the title of the article is Whole Plant Extracts versus Single Compounds for the Treatment of Malaria. And even though they're talking about malaria, it's the same concept of whole plants versus single compounds. And so I just want to read this little excerpt, which kind of reiterates what I was saying earlier about isolating plant compounds and how it can be detrimental. So it says bioavailability and metabolism of medicinal substances can be dramatically affected by other plant constituents. There are many possible mechanisms, including an increase in permeability of the membrane, inhibition of pump mechanisms for eliminating drugs, modification of absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of active constituents. So usually when you have a plant that works together, all of its compounds work together synergistically. These plants usually act on different receptors, different genes. And so if you only have one compound when you really need maybe 50 or 100 to act on a certain gene, you're not going to get the desired effect that you want from that drug or substance. And the last thing I want to say about that is that the purification of one isolated compound from a whole plant is inadequate for the clarification and explaining of pharmacological activity. So I don't know if you guys have heard of this term, but it says that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So basically, whole plants are better than isolated compounds. which is what they did in aspirin, in the case of aspirin. So I've been talking a lot about the willow tree. So you're probably like, what is a willow tree? So first of all, willow trees are everywhere. You've probably seen them. You probably see them all the time and just don't realize what it is. I actually have a willow tree right across the street from where I live. So you can actually make willow tea relatively easy. So this is an article I found, and it shows you how to make aspirin from a willow tree. So in this article, she's going to be showing you how to make a crude form of aspirin from the bark of a willow tree. It is a great remedy for headaches, hangovers, and other minor pain. The use of the willow tree as a mild pain reliever goes back to the Native Americans, who used it in much the same way that we do, people who use it for headaches. And then she explains it a little bit more. She says commercial aspirin is a chemical called acetylsalicylic acid, and she's going to be making an herbal tea that contains salicylic acid, which is the raw material from which acetylsalicylic acid is made. Right? She says, so she explains, so why did they convert it from raw salicylic acid? You can kind of read that. I'll post this article so you can read it on your own. She says pharmaceutical companies are not happy with just picking a leaf or cutting some bark from a tree. They like to concentrate everything and make it as potent as they can. However, if you do this with salicylic acid, it can cause stomach bleeding. But as long as you use it in a natural, unconcentrated form, like the willow bark tea we're going to make, it is perfectly safe. She has used it for years with no ill effects whatsoever. And as I mentioned in the other article, the Egyptians used it. People have used it for thousands of years, so it's perfectly safe. So this is what the willow tree looks like. There's many different species of willow trees. This is the weeping willow, and usually they'll name something after its characteristics. So it's called the weeping willow because the leaves hang down. It looks like it's weeping or crying. So this is the weeping willow here, and that's actually the tree that I have across the street from my house. And then they have the black willow, which looks like this. They have the golden willow, which is yellow, which also has its leaves kind of drooping down, looking like it's crying or weeping. And then you have the white willow. All of those are fine to use to make willow tea. However, the white willow contains the most salicylic acid, and it looks like this. She says that Cherokee folks say that this is the kind of willow that contains the most medicine, and all of the research she's done seems to confirm this. And this is a close-up of what the leaves look like. As you can see, they're all hanging downwards. Some of them are a little thicker. It just depends which tree you get it from. This is what the bark looks like. And she recommends to break off some of the leaves and smell them so that you can have, so that your brain can remember it, and also so that you can identify them, so you can take some home with you. So if you want to get some again, you kind of remember what it looks like. She also recommends to take a picture of it, which I think that's a great idea. So step 2, after you've identified that it's actually a willow tree, you'll want to cut a square of the bark. So you're going to need a good sharp knife, and then you're going to cut a square into the tree like so. She says make sure to cut it good and deep. Remember, you're trying to cut through both the inner bark and the outer bark. So for the tea, you want to use the inner bark, not the outer bark. Then you're going to stick your knife into one of the lines and gently pry forward. Go around the whole square, gently prying until you pull the square away from the tree. And so this is what it looks like. And so you'll notice that some of the bark is white and some of it is kind of pinkish. And you want the pinkish bark for the medicine. This is what she ended up with after she cut it. She ended up with a few big pieces and a little shreds. And this is what the tree looks like after she got done with it. She says, now, just in case you think that I have terribly damaged this tree,